It can seem like a tale of two Americas. The same nation that's spearheading the Me Too movement has a growing number of states that are either banning or severely restricting abortion rights. Alabama's governor signing into law an outright ban, except in cases where the woman's life is in danger. Next stop, well, the courts. Authors of the bill say their aim is to overturn the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion in the U.S. They'll probably fail, say legal scholars, this time around, but they've already scored major successes in curbing access to abortion. Why this push against reproductive rights, or is it gaining traction at this point? Yes, Donald Trump's naming of two conservatives to the U.S. Supreme Court, emboldening social conservatives, in particular the religious right, but this battle of values has been raging for decades. That tug of war is also playing out on the world stage, where for every nation like Chile or Ireland, which have decriminalized abortions, others are digging in their heels. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the battle over abortion. And joining us, Kate McKenna, member of Republicans Overseas. Thank you for being with us. I want to thank as well Ali McManus, who is a master's student at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, in American.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We're joined from Boulder, Colorado by legal analyst Jessica Mason-Pielko, who works for Rewire's News, and from Dallas, Texas, Stephanie Martin, who teaches at Southern Methodist University, author of the upcoming book, Republicans at Prayer, which looks at evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump. Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Every life is a sacred gift from God. Those the words in a statement by Alabama Governor Kay Ivey on Wednesday when she signed that bill into law. Kathy Clifford has more.
Calling to keep control of their bodies. This protest wasn't enough to stop the strictest abortion ban in the U.S. being signed into state law by Alabama's Republican Governor Kay Ivey. With an anti-abortion majority now sitting on the Supreme Court, some politicians have made no secret of their desire to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling.
It used to be that many people who opposed abortion thought that they should talk about this in a way that at least seemed as if they supported Roe v. Wade or that was the law of the land. Now we see that with an anti-choice majority on the Supreme Court, with Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch coming to the court under Trump's administration, that they feel really emboldened and they are being really explicit about their attempts.
The new Alabama legislation is set to come into effect across the state in 6 months' time, though pro-choice activists have vowed to fight it in court. Those performing the procedure would be punishable by up to 99 years in jail. It bans all abortions except when the mother's health is at risk, with no exception for rape or incest.
Was to address the issue that Roe versus Wade was decided on, which is that baby in the womb a person. In Alabama law, it's a person. Our people in Alabama voted last fall, but no law is constitutional until the Supreme Court actually revisits Roe versus Wade.
Legislation restricting abortion rights has been introduced in 16 U.S. states this year, with 4 of them banning abortion if an embryonic heartbeat can be found, often as early as 6 weeks, when many women wouldn't yet know they were pregnant.
Kate McKenna, what do you think of this bill?
I think that this is a result of a debate that needed to happen. I think, just a few months ago, we saw the New York legislature cheering the progression of abortion rights in New York State. So, we have both sides of the issue coming out here. I think it's a debate that needs to happen. I see that state, it's over the last decade, you've seen 300 laws passed at the state legislature level. So, they're passing pro-life elected officials into the legislature. So this is normal, that this is what's going to happen. You see an America that's more pro-life, that's growing, and they are feeling emboldened because of what the Trump administration has done. And
because people here in France a little bit shocked, particularly over this voting down of an amendment that would have said no exception in cases of rape or incest.
I think what they're doing here is they're really trying to force it back to the Supreme Court, just like they're doing with the heartbeat bill in Georgia. What they're doing is saying, hey, let's change the lieu of the debate. Let's bring it back to the people. But in order to do that, they need to declare the personhood of the unborn child. So that's really what this debate really boils down to.
And you're happy to see that fight?
I personally am happy to see that fight, yes.
Why is that?
Well, I am personally involved in as a mother, as someone who grew up with a respect of life, and having grown up with a mom who was a director of a pregnancy crisis center, also seeing numerous people in my family go through, difficult times with pregnancy, whether it be through drug or through teenage pregnancies, and helping them through that and seeing that the answer doesn't have to be abortion, that we can support women in other ways.
Ali McManus, your thoughts on why this is happening at this time?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and I'm so happy to be sitting across the table from Kate, because so often in the U.S. right now, we aren't having these conversations with people on the other side, and I think that's really contributing to this systematic disease of polarization and fragmentation. To answer your question, why do we think this is happening in the U.S. right now? I think it is because we are seeing a shift in politics in the U.S., and this is a topic that a lot of people are extremely passionate about. And I'm not pro-life when it comes to abortion, but I am pro-life when it comes to Black Lives Matter and when it comes to supporting children at the border. So it is something that I can be empathetic to, the passion of people on the other side as me.
And what do you make of this vote in Alabama? Because it's difficult, for people here in Europe to understand.
So I would agree with Kate when she's saying that the ultimate goal, I think, is to bring this to the Supreme Court again. I think that is the objective. But of course, when Brett Kavanaugh was going through his whole confirmation process, this was a huge concern for a lot of people who were pro-choice. Is this right going to be at risk? So my view is, I think that in the coming months, we saw the Louisiana issue was struck down in February. So we'll see the coming months if this ends up actually, manifesting or developing into something, and how the court actually ends up defending itself.
And what's your personal view on the vote?
On whether we should be pro-life or if I'm pro-life or pro-choice?
On this bill in Alabama.
I think that it's a very controversial topic. I personally believe that every woman has the right, every family has the right to determine how many children we have and at what point. And I think that it's really important that we can also not just include in this conversation about abortion, but access to family planning and access to contraception, which is really a huge problem in the U.S., and sexual education. So I think without those things, it's really putting many individuals, men and women, in a really uncomfortable position when maybe you are a married couple, maybe you have 2 or 3 children, you can't afford it anymore, you're using a condom, but it breaks or, it doesn't work because we know that contraception is not 100% effective. What's going to happen then? Are you going to have to bear the consequences of having a child? And I know this is a very, very controversial issue, but I think we also have to remember that there are 400,000 children that are in foster care in the U.S. right now, and many of these children are growing up without proper access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that on both sides of the table, that is something that we can agree that we want every single U.S. citizen and person residing within the U.S. and globally to have access to those 3 things.
Stephanie Martin, you heard just there Ali McManus say at the outset how this is a conversation that's not happening in the United States. The two sides don't speak to each other?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of public discourse and rhetoric, and one thing that we point out is that this is a conversation that is actually not in stasis. Stasis means that the two sides in any kind of argument agree to the terms of debate. And so what we like to talk about, and it's just happened right here between your two guests, the side that wants to defend reproductive freedom very often talks about the rights of women and the rights of families to self-determine and to have the right to say, to speak to their own political rights, right? The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. people who are anti-abortion or against abortion very often want to talk about when life begins and what happens at conception and when there is a baby. And so what I'm pointing to is the fact that you have one side that is talking about women and families and the rights to self-determination there, and you have the other side that is talking about babies in the womb and when life begins. And so they're actually not, when you stop and think about it, they're not arguing about the same thing. And it is never a good idea, or neither side has an advantage by agreeing to the terms of the debate set forth on the other side. The side that is anti-abortion doesn't want to talk about whether or not women have the right to self-determine, because they don't want to say that women don't have that right. Okay, they don't want to talk about that. And the side that is in favor of the side that is and the side that wants to keep rights to reproductive freedom open, they don't want to talk really about when life begins and whether or not there is an actual life at stake, because that is not advantageous to them. You even heard your guest, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name. She didn't actually want to answer your question. She sort of dodged it, the question about, are you in favor of this bill, even though ultimately she does favor access to abortion, because it's difficult. One thing that the anti-abortion side in the United States has done a very good job of winning the debate is making it even difficult for people who support abortion rights to say, yes, I support abortion, right? And you can feel that because that debate is not in stasis. And because we can't agree to the terms of the debate, we can't agree to what's ultimately at stake, it is an issue that is almost intractable.
An issue that's almost intractable, and is either side winning the argument according to your research, or is it simply that one side right now is more galvanized than the other?
So it's very interesting because it depends on how you define winning. Because 20 years ago, 60% of Americans polled supported access to abortion in all or most circumstances. I looked at the data just before we started this conversation, 60%. And now 58% of Americans support abortion in all or most circumstances. So that's more than a majority. In politics, 60% is a very high number. 58% is a very high number of support. And yet, most of the conversation that we're having now and the laws being passed, for the most part, are about restricting abortion. And abortion rights advocates have a majority on the Supreme Court, and abortion rights are very much at risk in the United States. So public opinion appears to be on the side of having access to abortion in the United States, but the laws are moving away from that public opinion. So I don't know who it depends, I would say, on what you mean by winning.
All right, it's not just Alabama, by the way. Kentucky, Mississippi, Ohio, Georgia have recently approved bans on abortion once a fetal heartbeat is detected. In other words, in the 6th week of pregnancy. There you can see the map. In red are the states, this is just in the year 2019, that have passed new measures that either ban or curtail abortion further. And then there are in yellow the states where legislation is in the works. You can add one more, by the way, state to that list, and that is Missouri, where the state Senate passed a measure overnight.
That right yet to live. And that's what we should be all doing, and that's what we're dedicated to do. That's why it's important for this legislation to get done. It's important for this legislation to get done right now. And we're until 6 o'clock on Friday. I really believe this legislation will get done, because I believe it is the will of the people, and the people's voices will be heard.
And for more of this, let's go to Boulder, Colorado now. Legal analyst Jessica Mason-Pielko, who works for Rewire.news. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Your reaction to what you just heard from Missouri's governor and from the momentum of the anti-abortion camp.
Well, I mean, I think that the momentum is most certainly on their side in terms of legislative activity. I appreciate what the person before me had noted in terms of public opinion and how they are sort of legislating from the minority, very much so in this country. And the reality is that it will, you listed states. We've got Missouri. There's Louisiana. There's legislation moving also in Alaska. So this is something that is a moment that anti-choice lawmakers in the United States feel that they have, and they are seizing on it, and that has become very clear.
And what happens now? It's going to go to the courts. How does it work? Will it go to the Supreme Court?
It very well could. I mean, the first thing to remind folks is that none of these laws are actually in effect yet. Even the measure that was signed yesterday in Alabama is not slated to take effect until 2020, and advocates have promised a legal challenge, and I would expect them to make good on that promise. So what we have right now is shaping up for a year or two of protracted legal battles over these various litigations in points across the country. And then with so many cases, it is likely and almost inevitable that one of them will end up before the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court right now already has 3 petitions that it is considering taking, and that is from earlier waves of these anti-choice laws and litigation. So it's really a question of not if, but when the Roberts Court steps back into the abortion debate in some real substantive fashion.
All right, when we come back, we're going to put it to the rest of our panelists to what happens next and why America is so bitterly divided. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're speaking after the governor of the U.S. state of Alabama signed into law an outright ban on abortion for all, except in the case where the mother's life is in danger. There would be no penalties on the woman. However, there would be stiff prison sentences for the doctor carrying out, or the practitioner carrying out, the abortion. Joining us is Kate McKenna, member of Republicans Overseas. Welcome back as well to Ali McManus, master's student at Sciences Po here in Paris, the French Political Science Institute. From Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, Stephanie Martin, the author of the upcoming book Republicans at Prayer. And joining us from Boulder, Colorado, legal analyst Jessica Mason-Pielko of Rewire.news. Who says she does expect a showdown in the courts over this, and perhaps all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, Stephanie Martin, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, putting on the bench justices who would favor this side of the argument, was that high on his list of priorities?
Well, he was the first person to ever run for office and explicitly state that he would appoint only pro-life judges to the bench, that he would have a litmus test. Normally, candidates for office say that they will not have a litmus test for the judiciary. They signal that, they say it without saying it, but he came right out and said that. And so that was a very interesting thing that he did. And he has followed through on that pledge very clearly, and evangelical voters are happy with his having done that. And so that probably does explain some of his continued popularity. It's interesting because one of the things the Alabama governor said in her remarks about the law was that it was to undo, quote, the text of Roe v. Wade, which was the question about whether or not, when she was talking about that case, whether or not that was a baby, that was a life. And what's interesting about that is that the text of Roe v. Wade, very few people are very familiar with what the text of that case is, but the judges who wrote in that decision, they're very clear that they cannot take up the question of whether or not the baby, there's about the infant life, right? That was in the early 1970s. There was not the technology that we have now. And the decision is absolutely predicated on women's health and the decision and the conversation that has to take place between a woman and her doctor and the question of medical privacy.
Yeah, and
that may or may not be important to people now. That may or may not be how people in 2019 think about the question of abortion. But what's very interesting from a public discourse standpoint, what's very interesting from a public discourse standpoint is that feels disingenuous, I think, to people who are on the anti-abortion side. But it actually is very important to the text of the case and how the justices should be thinking about that, I would say, from the standpoint of precedent and how the decision is written, because they disavow in the decision the question of infant life.
The disavow the question of infant life, and there's maybe you can address this, Jessica Mason-Pielko, this issue of 24 weeks being a crucial point in a pregnancy. Can you explain that? Jessica Mason-Pielko, you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Yes, absolutely.
I can explain that if you happen to have...
Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, I'm here. Yeah, so a couple points. The justices of Roe v. Wade absolutely said that it was inappropriate for the courts to weigh in on the question of whether or not life begins at conception from a legal perspective, in part because of where medical technology was at the part, but also because of the role of the courts in determining like that. So I think that is some important context in this debate, as we have lawmakers who have written laws such as Alabama's ban that specifically state that life conception, and this is a legal point for courts to decide, because that's some part of the conversation moving forward. In terms of the shape of the legal landscape, and looks like, I mean, we have more judges now than we ever have in our life have an explicit mission to overturn the precedent. And so I think the bounds of the conversation are absolutely changing in that part, and there's a lot happening in American abortion politics right now. And some of it's playing out in the courts, and some of it is playing out differently in the states in terms of access. You had mentioned the Alabama law not targeting people who have terminated pregnancies, but you have to ask yourself how such a law is enforced. And there will be no way for the state to determine what is a legally acceptable end of a pregnancy versus a legally unacceptable one. And we know that to be true because these kinds of situations are already happening in places like Alabama. So it's one thing to have the conversation about the theoretical decision on life that the court might have to take, but it's also very important to ground that in the fact that women in the ground in places like Alabama are actually facing consequences from the state for failed pregnancy outcomes, and this will only exacerbate that.
Yeah, we could see situations like we've seen. I'll put the question to you, Kate McKenna, in Central America, where women have gone to jail for over failed pregnancies, being accused of murder in some cases.
Well, we're not talking about Central America. We're talking about the United States of America, and we're not the same thing. So I think we need to bring the conversation back to the United States and see what's happening. People have come up with that and declared that, women are going to go to jail specifically with the Georgia heartbeat bill, and that's just absolute nonsense. I recommend David French in National Review wrote a great article about that. Going back to the Supreme Court.
And I recommend people Google Purvi Patel in Indiana, who was actually sentenced to 20 years under a situation for self-termination. So it is not, I apologize for interrupting, but it's not a hypothetical. It's an actual reality in the United States.
It's also a reality that we need to take some things and back to the Supreme Court. When we go back to the Supreme Court, if the issue goes back, it's not going to overturn Roe v. Wade and make it illegal all over the country. I believe what will happen was it will just bring the power back and the decision making back to the states. And that's the thing about the U.S. is each state legislature has the power. It's elected. It's our system. We have a democratic republic. This is how we run things in the United States. Alabama, it was 24-5. It was a huge majority. It wasn't just a little number of state legislators saying, hey, this was the majority of people that were elected by the people of Alabama.
The French media highlighted the fact that in the Alabama Senate, it was all white men, the Republicans, who voted for the bill.
I'm a woman standing here telling you, I'm not from Alabama, but, I think, what about all the pro-life women that go over it? I think their voices are ignored. And this wouldn't be happening over the United States if we didn't have a vast majority of people starting to become aware. As technology continues, as we see more medical technology, we see the reality of when life begins. And then the question of is the unborn child a person, and does that person deserve legal protection? This debate is just going to get stronger. And it's so important that we do this. It's been kind of a hidden thing for so long, and I think it's really good it's getting out there. And again, don't forget, New York State just passed a law that increased abortion law, rights. Same thing in Virginia, they're talking about it. So this isn't just a one-way street. This is, you see, two Americas, two things happening. So, we're talking about this today, but there's other things happening.
That's important, that geographical divide that you mentioned. That's a crucial point here, because you have research that shows 3/4 of abortions are concern people who are either poor or lower middle class, do those people have the ability to travel to these other states, and if they want to terminate a pregnancy?
I can't answer that, but I do know that there is a lot of good care outside of abortion. My mother, like I said, my family's been really dedicated in working with people, and I've seen it on the ground in numerous places, including Delaware, Virginia, Maryland. You've seen the care that is outside of government care, outside of Planned Parenthood. These are pregnancy crisis centers where they offer help and hope for these women. I think it's important that these women have a real choice, a true choice, not just told that this thing inside them is a blob of cells, that they're given a real option to understand what it is and what they're doing.
Ali McManus?
I do just want to jump off a point where, back to your Central America question, and I don't think that this issue is specific to the United States. Sorry. And I'm referring specifically to the global gag rule, which is affecting the United States Agency of International Development's funding towards NGOs and other organizations across the entire planet, and restricting their communication on family planning and abortion access. So this is part of the reason why Donald Trump cut $23 million to the UNFPA in the past year. And maybe in the US our situation might be a bit better, but if you're thinking about people who are living in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, and I don't mean to make broad generalizations, but they don't have the same access to healthcare when it comes to giving birth. I mean, the maternal mortality rate is extremely high. So I think that we do also need to think that what's happening in the US isn't just specific to my life as an American woman or Kate's life as an American woman. The ideological shift is having a tremendous impact on women across the globe.
Beyond U.S. borders.
For sure.
Stephanie Martin?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, when Kate was speaking, the question of the geographical divide and the question of how, I don't know if Kate identifies this way or not, but the idea, what she mentioned, the system of constitutional, the Democratic Republic of the United States, and the idea that different states could operate in different kinds of ways. And that is actually a precious belief to evangelical Christians, and the notion of religious liberty and being allowed to set things up and do things separate, and different areas could do things different ways. And I just thought I would mention that because I know that you had asked me earlier to sort of help sort through how the United States is different than maybe how things operate, how European countries operate. And one thing that evangelicals think about and is really important to them is the idea of local control and being able to think through how local churches and local stories and local traditions can sort of supersede what is happening at the national level. And it's an interesting dynamic that takes place. And that is what you hear a lot in the way that anti-abortion activists will talk about things like abortion, and the idea that if we can just have a close relationship and we can just talk to people and help them understand that there is a bigger purpose to their lives than this momentary crisis of, say, a pregnancy, we can walk them through that and we can get to a better solution than ending this pregnancy. And I don't know that that is something to be just dismissed out of hand if the point is to get a conversation started and move past that inability to generate stasis. Because one thing that, as I have listened to these conversations go, one thing that reproductive rights activists have in common with anti-abortion activists, one thing that they have in common is the sense that people who are facing unwanted pregnancies, they all agree that these are difficult moments in life. What they desperately disagree about is what options should be available. But meeting together in the fact that everybody cares about these women and convincing each other that there's actual care for the women, that is an opportunity to actually have a conversation. They will be very difficult conversations, but the fact that both sides care about the women is a useful place to begin if ever there's any progress to be made. But one thing that I would encourage the anti-abortion activists to take care about is using phrases like vast majority, a vast majority, because it's not a vast majority of people who are on their side. In fact, as we pointed out earlier, most people in the United States support access to abortion. And so the fact that they have a lot of media coverage and the fact that they have the legislative agenda on their side doesn't mean that a vast majority of people support their point of view.
A question that's central in all of this is here in France.
And that only adds, I guess I would wrap up by saying, that only makes it harder to have any kind of conversation.
Here in France, we saw abortion legalized in 1974. Mm-hmm. And with European elections coming up now, it's a non-issue. It's just, at the time, it was bitterly divisive. Now it's the law of the land. And the issue has gone away. No, practically, except for maybe a couple of very fringe politicians, no one talks about it here. Does it surprise you as an American in Paris that this is such a hot button issue in the US and not at all talked about here?
No, I think each country has its own dynamics.
How do you explain it?
Well, I think it's a cultural issue. And I think, especially in the media, a lot of issues have been pushed under as really just taboo. But going back quickly to...
It's not a taboo. It's just...
It is. Well, I wouldn't say it's a consensus. There's a whole lot of pro-life people, and you see that at the March for Life here. And there's a lot of people who aren't perhaps, I wouldn't say courageous enough, but don't feel at liberty to be able to come out and express because they'll be so quelched by the media sometimes, by the political arena. But again, I'm an American and we have the right to talk about this. But just quickly, I just want to go back to the fact that we do go to civil society. That's not a dream or something evangelicals think about. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America, the United States of America was built not depending on the state, but depending on civil society. That includes churches, community, what have you. And that's still very true today. We have a huge civil society, much larger than many other countries. And we do depend a great deal on that, more so than the government.
Ali McManus, your thoughts on why it's such a big deal in America, this issue, and here it's not?
I think it goes down to the fact that our church and state, and this is my opinion, is seeing less separation than we have in previous years. And I think that in France and perhaps other European countries, there is a bit more of a distinction between the two. So I think that we've seen we hear the way presidents talk their candidates for presidency are talking about in the campaigns about God and religion, and it's a very different type of conversation and dialogue that is occurring than you would see here. So I think that's one of the primary reasons.
It's about religious belief, this issue?
I often think that I often see, and maybe Kate, you might disagree with me, but I often see that those who are pro-life often back their religious belief or their belief in the Bible and these types of things as the fundamental principles behind their opinion on the issue.
I think you can just look at the natural law. I think an embryo at its earliest phases meets the 4 qualifications of a biological life. You've got, I don't want to get this wrong, metabolism, growth, response to stimuli, and reproduction. If we don't interrupt that process of an embryo, it will be born, it will age, it will mature, could reproduce, and then it will die. There is so much to discuss on this issue, but I don't think it's just because religious people support it that it's a religious issue. I do believe, going back, I did think of something about France. I think France is much more private as far as your discussion in private things about, the marriage and your personal life. I think that France keeps things on a more quiet level. In America, we're much more open. We saw that when Clinton had an affair. We're going to talk about that. When a French president has an affair, it's not the huge scandal that it is that we had in the United States.
But Stephanie Martin, because you've gone for your research and spoken with evangelicals. Speaking of affairs, they're able to look past Donald Trump's personal life, but when it comes to as long as he backs them on this issue, why is that? What did they tell you?
Yeah. Well, so quickly, the reason I think, first of all, I think that this is an argument not in stasis. So that's one reason why it doesn't settle in the United States. The second is that the Supreme Court ruled on it. When it comes to Donald Trump with evangelicals, I think the reason why they supposedly overlook it is more simple than it's more simple than people may think, and it's that evangelicals, as much as anyone else, are actually tired of the culture wars, and they don't want to. Most evangelicals are actually not politically crazed. That's just the media portrayal of them. When you go inside their churches, you talk to them, you listen to their sermons. They feel committed to voting. They feel committed to the idea that the United States is a pretty exceptional democracy. They want to see it go forward. They like the idea of returning to a so-called greater period in the past when traditional values held. So they like the idea of making America great again. But they really didn't like Hillary Clinton. But they don't want to fight the culture wars over and over and over again any more than most people. They're tired of it. So Bill Clinton was 20 years ago, and now it's Donald Trump. And, so I refer to it as a rhetoric of active passivism. And when, it's like be active, vote, do your part, whatever it is, that thing. But then be passive and trust that God has things in control and he will work things out for good ultimately. And so if it's not okay, it's not the end, right? It'll be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, then it's not the end. And so you be active and vote, but then just rest in God's will. And that's how most evangelicals think about it. And they would rather talk about scrapbooking or fishing or basketball or their next trip to France to see the Louvre or, take in the Notre Dame and hope that it's, being rebuilt to God's glory. They don't want to talk about politics either. And the fact that Donald Trump is keeping his word about appointing the right judges keeps them in his camp. And so that was a little bit of a rambly answer, but, it's just the politics of cultural values have kind of worn out their welcome in the United States.
All right, fascinating, and there's so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we're running short on time. Stephanie Martin, I want to thank you so much. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay with the Skype connection with Dallas, but I want to thank you so much for joining us from Dallas, Texas. I want to thank Jessica Mason-Pielko for being with us from Boulder, Colorado. Kate McKenna, Ali McManus. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon, who I can say it hails from Ireland, which legalized abortion.
That's right.
In 2018,
although north of the border, it's still an issue. But I might show something on that actually at the very end. But I'll start, Francois, with this tweet by Alyssa Milano, who kickstarted. That's right, and she kickstarted the whole Me Too discussion.
Who actually called for abstinence?
Say again?
She actually called for abstinence.
That's right. And I'll show you this first tweet that she put up on this. First of all, not one uterus, not one uterus. Now she was referring to 22 senators in Alabama who were voting on this. Now, just to kind of nuance the debate a little bit, that's not strictly speaking true. There were, and in fact, women tend to vote more along party lines than on gender lines when it comes to this issue. And the Washington Post has been looking at that. With state-by-state graphics. You can see here circles indicating women. For the most part, female Republicans voted for this bill. But you do see some male voices being raised here. in disagreement with this. For any woman out there tonight who is afraid, angry, in disbelief, or feeling disenfranchised, know this: I am with you and I will fight for you. That's Doug Jones, who is a US Senator for Alabama. You also have, this is the minority Democrat leader in Alabama as well, who gave a very emotional speech. We don't have time to listen to an extract, but what he said is, you just said to my daughter, you don't matter. So it really has activated this very touchy, very sensitive debate. To get back to Alyssa Milano, indeed, she called for abstinence. There was this viral hashtag calling for a sex strike. And the idea being, if we don't have control over our bodies, then let's not even take the risk of an unwanted pregnancy. Now, that did, of course, elicit in itself a debate within the debate, if you like. The French Junior Minister for Equality between Men and Women weighing in on that.
Disagreed with Alyssa.
Disagreeing, saying, well, actually, women also lose out in that particular strike action. And in any case, there were lots of voices chiming in on that. This is she's published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and has written a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. This is Ijeoma Olua. She also didn't agree with this. She calls it this white feminist sex strike is in response to anti-abortion is nonsensical. She went on to say that she was a mother of 2 boys, and when I raised them as feminists, I did not ever set any expectation that their support of women's rights would give them access to women's bodies, because that is not feminism. In any case, you can see that it set off a whole chain reaction of comments in that regard. Tara Strong, another actress, speaking here, saying, how about a bill to force men to have vasectomies until they're ready to be fathers? Jail time for using sex-trafficked women at massage parlours. Anyway, some of it was satire, I think, to an extent. But to get back to some serious statistics, today, there were polls looking into this. 73% of Americans don't want to see the Supreme Court case that brought in the right to termination of pregnancy, to see Roe versus Wade overturned, which actually, this is interesting to go back to the culture wars that you were just talking about. This could backfire on Donald Trump, actually. According to analysis of those statistics, Roe versus Wade is in danger. So is Trump if it goes down. And so there are quite a lot of pieces about how this is becoming a key issue in 2020, but actually it's just going to reactivate both bases in both parties. So it's not necessarily going to be
it's who gets energized more.
Exactly.
All right.
And just quickly, there's been conversation in the UK and Ireland as well about how Northern Ireland actually has even more restrictive legislation still when it comes to abortion. So it's actually put the spotlight on abortion legislation elsewhere in the world as well.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.